The mansion stood tall and proud, its white walls glowing in the morning sun. But inside those walls lived a woman who was treated as though she was invisible. Every day she rose before dawn, quietly tying back her hair, pulling on her simple clothes, and beginning the endless work no one else wanted to do. The sweeping of the grand marble floors, the polishing of silver trays, the carrying of heavy laundry baskets that seemed taller than her. These were the rhythms of her life. She moved softly, almost silently, like a shadow gliding from room to room, making sure the house sparkled before the family awoke. But silence could not protect her from the words. The daughters of the house, dressed in silk gowns and glittering jewels, never missed a chance to remind her of what they thought she was. To them, she was nothing more than the help, a servant who belonged on her knees. As she served their breakfast, one of them laughed, pointing at her worn shoes. "Look at her," the girl said, her voice dripping with scorn. "She doesn't even belong in this house." The others giggled, hiding their mouths behind jeweled hands, as if the sight of her was too ridiculous to be real. The maid bowed her head, not because she agreed, but because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her anger. Her heart ached, yes, but she carried it quietly, swallowing the pain with dignity. Inside, her spirit whispered words only she could hear. Someday the tables will turn, at dinner parties. When the chandeliers glowed and music filled the air, her place was not at the table but behind it, carrying trays of food, refilling crystal glasses, and slipping unnoticed between guests. Yet she was not truly unseen. The daughters loved to make her the center of their cruel entertainment. One evening, when the room was filled with laughter and chatter, one of them deliberately tipped her glass so wine spilled across the carpet. "Quick, maid! Clean this before anyone sees!" she barked, loud enough for every guest to turn and stare. The maid dropped to her knees, blotting the red stain, while the young women cackled like it was the funniest trick they had ever played. Some guests laughed along, enjoying the cruelty. Others looked away, uncomfortable, whispering behind their fans. But no one spoke up for her. No one stopped the humiliation. That was her place after all, wasn't it? At least that's what they believed. "She's only good for scrubbing floors," one daughter sneered during another gathering, her voice sharp and cruel. The words cut like knives, but the maid did not cry. She kept her eyes down, her face calm. She had learned long ago that her silence was her shield. Still, deep inside, a fire burned. Every insult was fuel. Every cruel laugh was a spark. And when the parties ended, when the music died down and the lights dimmed, the daughters went to bed in their silk sheets, never once thinking of the woman still awake, washing dishes until her hands ached. The maid worked in the quiet of night, her body tired but her spirit unbroken. She moved slowly, carefully, holding her pain close like a secret. But in her heart she carried a certainty the daughters could never imagine. Because while they mocked her, while they treated her as if she were nothing, she knew something they did not. She knew her worth was not in the rags she carried or the floors she polished. It was in her patience, her strength, and her hidden plans that no one could see. The nights stretched on, each insult remembered, each humiliation tucked away, not as weakness, but as strength. And as the dawn returned and she tied her hair again to begin another day, her lips curled into the faintest of smiles. They thought she was beneath them. They thought she was powerless. But one day the same mouths that mocked her would fall silent. For now, she endured, calm as ever. She endured every cruel laugh, every mocking word, every dismissive glance. But beneath that quiet exterior lived a woman preparing for something greater. And soon, when the family's cruelty reached its peak, the world inside the mansion would begin to shift. The stage was set. The suffering was real, and the moment of truth was drawing closer. The mansion glittered that night. Chandeliers sparkled above the ballroom, music floated through the air, and guests in shimmering gowns and sharp suits filled the room with laughter. It was one of the richest parties of the season, and the family wanted to impress everyone who walked through their golden doors. Servants rushed back and forth carrying trays of wine and plates of delicate food, but among them moved one woman more quietly than the rest, the housemaid. She slipped between the crowds, her plain dress in sharp contrast to the jewels and silks around her. Her job was simple: keep the glasses full, the tables clean, and herself invisible. But the daughters of the house would not allow her to remain unseen. They were hunting for entertainment, and she was their favorite target. The eldest daughter, tall and sharp-eyed, spotted her across the room. She smirked and whispered to her sisters. Together they turned to the guests nearby, their laughter growing louder as their eyes locked on the maid. "Watch this," one of them whispered. Then, with a deliberate flick of her hand, she tipped her glass and sent red wine spilling across the floor. "Oh no, maid," she cried, loud enough for every head to turn. "Come quickly before the carpet is ruined." The maid set her tray down and hurried forward, kneeling with a cloth. Her fingers moved swiftly, blotting the stain before it spread. She felt the heat of every eye on her back, the sting of their whispers curling around the room. The daughters stood above her, smirking as if she were a performer in a cruel show. "Don't forget to bow when you leave the room, maid," one daughter sneered, her voice dripping with arrogance. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Some guests covered their mouths politely, others chuckled openly, and a few shifted uncomfortably, lowering their eyes. But no one spoke up. No one dared challenge the daughters in their own house. The maid's cheeks burned, but her face stayed calm. Inside, her heart trembled with pain, yet she swallowed it down, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She kept her head low, her hands steady, and whispered silently to herself. "They see a servant," but never the woman behind her silence. The night went on, and so did the cruelty. Later, as she carried a tray of empty glasses past the group of daughters, they stopped her with mocking smiles. "Tell us," one of them said loudly, "is it true you grew up in the slums? Did your family eat from scraps, or was that just a rumor?" The guests around them gasped softly, but the daughters laughed like it was the grandest joke of the evening. The maid's steps faltered, her grip tightening on the tray until her knuckles turned white. She longed to speak, to tell them she was more than what they thought, but her voice remained trapped in her throat. She bowed her head slightly and walked on, her silence becoming her shield once again. Another sister leaned close to her friend and whispered just loud enough for the maid to hear. "Look at her clothes, a rag among silk." Then louder, she said, "Maybe we should gift her one of our old dresses, though I doubt it would fit someone so plain." Their laughter rang out, high and cruel, echoing across the grand hall. The maid's chest tightened, every insult pressing down like a weight, but her spirit would not bend. She reminded herself that her worth did not rest in their hands. They saw only what they wanted to see, a servant who scrubbed floors, who bowed her head, who stayed quiet. But behind that quiet was a woman with more strength than they could ever understand. The cruelty of that night carved itself deep into her memory. She could still feel the sting of their words, still hear the echo of their laughter bouncing off the ballroom walls. And as the guests continued to whisper and glance at her with pity or amusement, she felt the fire inside her grow hotter. She endured, as she always had. She moved through the night with steady hands and unshaken grace, but with every step she carried a silent promise. They would not laugh forever. Their arrogance, their cruelty, their blind confidence in their wealth and status, it would not last. And soon, very soon, the moment would come when the daughters who mocked her would have no choice but to face the truth. The woman they thought was invisible, the maid they treated as nothing, would one day stand taller than them all. That night's humiliation was not the end. It was the peak of their cruelty. And what comes after cruelty is the turning point. The mansion grew quiet after the parties ended. The laughter, the music, the cruel whispers, all of it faded into silence. The daughters lay asleep in their silk beds, their jewels scattered carelessly across the tables beside them. But in the servants' quarters, a single light still glowed. The housemaid sat at a small wooden desk, her back straight, her face calm, her hands moving with quiet precision. The same hands that had scrubbed floors all day now unfolded neat stacks of papers, property deeds, business contracts, bank statements carefully organized and bound with clips. She pulled out her worn notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting and calculations that would have confused the very daughters who called her uneducated. With a calm focus, she reviewed every number, every line, every plan. Her phone buzzed softly. She answered in a whisper, not wanting to disturb the silence. On the other end was a supplier, confirming a shipment for her small but growing business. Her voice was steady, professional, nothing like the trembling servant the daughters thought she was. "Yes," she said firmly. "The payments are cleared. The next delivery will expand our reach. Keep the quality high. I expect nothing less." She hung up and leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a small smile. They laughed at her clothes, her shoes, her silence. They thought she was beneath them. But they did not know about the world she had built outside these walls. A world where she was not a maid, but a leader. A businesswoman. A landowner. She looked down at her hands, rough from cleaning, scarred from labor, yet strong and capable. "They laugh at my hands," she whispered into the stillness. "But these hands built something they will never own." Her voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. Each night followed the same pattern. She would serve all day, bow her head when mocked, and then, when the house slept, she became someone else. She was the strategist, the planner, the woman piecing together a future that grew larger with each passing week. Her strength was not in shouting back or lashing out. Her strength was patience, steady and sharp. She reminded herself often, "The best revenge is patience." And she believed it with all her heart. While the daughters wasted their days gossiping, shopping and laughing at those they deemed lesser, she was buying property, small plots at first, then larger ones, each signed quietly under her name. While they flaunted dresses that would be forgotten within a season, she was building an empire that would last for generations. They saw her as nothing, yet she was quietly becoming everything. The audience watching her story can feel the shift now. The balance of power is not what it seems. She is no longer just a maid, and she never truly was. Every document she signs, every call she makes, every coin she saves is a step toward the moment when the mask will fall and the truth will be revealed. And all the while, the daughters remain blind. They laugh louder each day, their arrogance growing, their cruelty sharper, never once noticing the quiet fire in the woman who serves them. Their world is built on appearances, on wealth that seems unshakable. But beneath the glittering surface, their fortune is fragile, their downfall already on its way. The maid closes her notebook, blows out her candle, and lays down to rest for a few hours before dawn. Tomorrow, she will rise again, tie her hair back, and put on the mask of the humble servant. She will endure the insults, the mockery, the laughter, but inside, she will carry the truth they cannot see, that she is stronger, smarter, and already steps ahead of them. The tension now grows heavy, like the calm before a storm. The daughter's cruelty has reached its peak, the maid's strength is rising in silence, and soon, very soon, the world inside that mansion will turn upside down. Their fortune will falter, their arrogance will collapse, and the woman they treated as nothing more than furniture will step forward and reveal who she truly is. The story is no longer about a powerless servant. It is about a woman preparing for the moment when patience turns into power, when silence becomes her sharpest weapon. And that moment is coming quickly, for the downfall of the family is just around the corner. The morning light spilled through the tall windows of the mansion, painting golden streaks across the polished floors. But this time, the footsteps echoing through those halls did not belong to a servant carrying trays or scrubbing floors. They belonged to the woman who now owned every stone, every chandelier, every inch of the house she once cleaned. The maid walked slowly, her posture calm and proud, not with arrogance, but with the quiet grace of someone who had earned her place. Her simple shoes tapped firmly against the marble, yet now they sounded like the steps of a queen. The daughters watched her from a distance, their eyes hollow with shame, no longer dressed in glittering gowns, no longer surrounded by admirers. They stood small and powerless in the very halls they once ruled. Their laughter was gone, their pride had crumbled, and for the first time in their lives, they had to look up at the woman they had always looked down on. She paused at the grand staircase, resting her hand on the railing she had polished countless times. The memory of her bending here with a rag flashed before her eyes, and for a moment she almost felt the sting of their voices mocking her again. But then she smiled softly. That woman, the one they called dirty and worthless, was gone. In her place stood the true version of herself, the one who had always existed, but was hidden beneath silence and patience. The daughters lowered their heads, unable to meet her gaze. One of them whispered, her voice trembling, We didn't know." The maid looked at them, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "You never cared to know," she said gently. "You saw only what you wanted to see." She stepped closer, her words carrying the weight of every insult she had endured, yet delivered without cruelty. "I was never just the maid. I was the woman you should have respected." Her words fell heavy in the silent hall. The daughters flinched, shame burning on their faces. But the maid did not linger on their discomfort. She had no desire to crush them further. She had already won, and her victory needed no cruelty. As she walked through the rooms, she remembered all the nights she had scrubbed floors, carrying her pain in silence while dreaming of this very moment. Yet standing here now, she felt no anger, only peace. The mansion was hers, not through chance, not through arrogance, but through patience, resilience, and strength. She turned once more to the daughters and spoke words that would echo in their minds forever. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Respect is earned, not bought. And kindness, even in silence, is stronger than cruelty. The daughters nodded weakly, their pride gone. They had been humbled in the harshest way, and though it pained them, they could no longer deny her worth. The maid, no, the woman of the house, stood tall, her presence filling the space that had once made her feel small. She didn't laugh at their downfall. She didn't mock them as they had mocked her. Instead, she offered them something they had never given her: dignity. She walked to the grand doors, opening them wide to let the sunlight flood in. The air felt different, lighter, freer. The mansion that once symbolized her suffering was now a monument to her strength. For the guests who had witnessed her humiliation in the past, her story became a lesson whispered across the town. A lesson about appearances, about arrogance, and about the power of those who endure in silence. And for those who had once laughed at her, their laughter had turned into awe, their whispers into respect. As she stood at the entrance of her mansion, the corners of her lips curved into a serene smile. Her journey had been long, painful, and lonely, but it had led her here, to victory, to respect, to a life she had built with her own 2 hands. And with her calm voice, she spoke the truth she had carried all along, words that would stay in the hearts of everyone who heard her story. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it rises when no one expects it. I was never invisible. I was never worthless. I was simply patient. And patience built my empire. Her story ended not with revenge but with dignity, not with cruelty but with grace. And in that grace was the most powerful lesson of all: that true strength hides in silence, and those who seem the smallest can rise to become greater than anyone ever imagined. The fall of the family came faster than anyone expected. The mansion, once filled with music and laughter, now echoed with arguments and slammed doors. Whispers of failed investments spread through the town. Creditors arrived one after another, their voices sharp, their demands impossible to ignore. Servants were dismissed, carriages sold, jewels pawned off piece by piece. The proud family that once stood so tall was crumbling, and for the first time, the daughters who had lived their lives in silk and luxury felt the cold edge of fear. The grand hall, once the stage for endless parties, became the meeting place for lawyers and bankers. Papers were spread across the table, signatures demanded, debts read aloud with no mercy. The daughters sat together, their painted faces pale, their laughter silenced. They watched helplessly as strangers stripped their world bare. The carpets they once danced across were being rolled up and carried away. The paintings that had decorated their walls for generations were hauled out the door, claimed by creditors as payment. How could this happen? The eldest daughter whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. We're supposed to be untouchable, but no one listened. No one comforted them. The empire they thought would last forever was vanishing in front of their eyes. And in the midst of their downfall, the maid stood silently in the corner, watching. She moved with her usual grace, calm and quiet, as if the chaos did not touch her. But inside, her heart was steady, strong, ready. This was the moment she had been preparing for in silence, the moment patience had promised her. When the final announcement came, that the mansion itself must be sold to cover the debts, the room fell into stunned silence. The daughters gasped, clutching each other as though their world had been ripped from beneath their feet. "Not the house," one cried. "This is ours. It's always been ours." But the lawyers were unmoved. The mansion was no longer theirs to claim. And then, like a soft wind cutting through the storm, the maid stepped forward. Her simple shoes tapped gently against the marble floor, echoing in the silent hall. She stood tall, her back straight, her face calm. All eyes turned to her, the woman they had treated as invisible now stepping into the center of the room. "I will buy it," she said softly, but her voice carried with strength. The daughters froze, staring at her in disbelief. For a moment they thought they had misheard, but when she repeated her words, steady and sure, the shock in the room deepened. "You?" one of the daughters shouted, her voice breaking with rage. "You're just a maid." The maid looked at her, her eyes calm, her lips forming a faint, confident smile. "No," she answered gently. "I'm the woman who now owns your house." Gasps filled the hall. The creditors exchanged glances. some smiling knowingly, for they had already seen her papers, her deeds, her wealth laid out in perfect order. The daughters, however, were struck silent, their mouths opening and closing like they had been robbed of breath. The youngest daughter shook her head in disbelief. "This can't be true. It's impossible. She's nothing." The maid stepped closer, her voice calm but sharp with truth. "You called me nothing because you only saw the rag in my hands, the shoes on my feet. But while you laughed, I was building. While you mocked, I was buying. And while you lived as if your wealth would last forever, I prepared for the day it would not." The words struck harder than any insult they had ever thrown at her. The daughters lowered their eyes, shame washing over them, but the maid did not gloat. She did not laugh. She simply stood tall, her dignity shining brighter than the chandeliers above them. The papers were signed, the transfer completed. The mansion, the symbol of their pride and arrogance, now belonged to the woman they had treated as less than human. The hall was silent, except for the scratching of pens and the heavy breathing of the defeated daughters. Guests who had once joined in their laughter now stared at the maid with awe, their silence filled with respect. In that moment, the balance shifted forever. The daughters who had lived to humiliate her now sat broken, staring up at the woman they had underestimated. And the maid, calm as ever, simply said, "Respect was all I ever wanted, but now I no longer need your respect. I have something greater. Your house." And with those words the story turned. The cruelty had met its karma, and the woman who once served quietly in the shadows now walked in the light of her victory. But her story was not yet finished. What she did with her power, how she carried her triumph, that would define the resolution yet to come.